Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Do you have a non-vendor team member performing the confirmation call? I don't recommend that unless certain steps are put into place to reduce the potential for both internal and external fraud. What are they? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 355. Before allowing non-team members to make confirmation calls, put these steps in place. All right, so first, let me just define a couple of things. So I'm going to define non-vendor team members or vendor team members versus non-vendor team members, and then also the confirmation call, although I know that you guys probably already know this, but just in case we've got some new folks. So when I talk about the vendor team, I am talking about those team members, which could be a completely separate team, or they could be part of the procurement team or the accounts payable team, or maybe a different team. But these are the folks that are typically responsible for creating a vendor, for editing a vendor, for doing or responding to inquiries either via email or on the phone. They have the add and edit access to the vendor master file. And so they have the responsibility for vendor setup and maintenance. Now, non-vendor team members are everyone else. These are folks that they use the vendor master file, right, to find vendors, to post invoices, to create POs, whatever team it's on or whatever team they're from, but they don't have add and edit access to the vendor master file. They don't create vendors. They don't update existing vendors. And so that is the difference between the vendor team and the non-vendor team members. Now, let's talk about the confirmation call. Now, the confirmation call, we should all know what that is. It is supposed to be the silver bullet that's supposed to end fraud. Well, we know that hasn't happened. But the confirmation call is where when a vendor, typically today is when a vendor submits, or you think it's a vendor that's submitting a request to change banking, then before the banking is changed, you contact the vendor using a trusted phone number, right, to verify that the change request came from them. And so, but we know that hasn't helped to avoid fraud because we still hear about it all the time. And we don't necessarily talk about it with internal fraud a lot, but we know that internal fraud continues to happen. And that's where employee fraudsters that have access to change banking on legitimate existing vendor records They do that. They change the banking before the pay cycle and then change it back after the pay cycle. Or they create a new fraudulent vendor and, of course, add fraudulent banking to this new vendor record. Now, that doesn't or isn't susceptible, right, to uh, having that confirmation call made because the person or team member that has access to add or edit vendor records or vendor banking, right? They just go and do it in the background. Now, for external fraudsters, where fraudulent emails are again received requesting a change in banking, we know that the confirmation call still, right, is not the silver bullet because fraud is still occurring. And that could be because, right, the confirmation call wasn't made because the vendor never picked up and the payment was made before the confirmation call could be done, or the confirmation call was done. However, it was done to the fraudsters because you didn't have, or those folks didn't have the vendor's contact information on the vendor master file. And so they went out on the web, Googled it. And of course, the fraudsters have, based on Google ads and knowing SEO, they put the fraudulent vendor site right on top or high up in the results. And so that information to contact the vendor was taken from that fraudulent site, or maybe it was just taken from the email, from the fraudulent email. Well, you and I know not to do that, but I will tell you that is being done out there because some of these vendors just don't have a web presence. You don't have that information in the vendor master file. And so depending on who you have doing the confirmation calls, they are just trying to get their work done. And so they'll use the information from the fraudulent email. Again, you and I know not to do that. Most folks know not to do that, but it is happening because the focus for them, at least, is just to get their work done. All right, so we know the confirmation call is put into place, and it's put into place so that you can reduce external fraud by having another layer, another person review the request. And right, two heads are better than one. One person might see red flags where the other person didn't. Plus, you've got a separate person, right, making the call, which, is kind of like separation of duties to avoid internal fraud because any change is supposed to run through that process. However, if you've got an internal person, right, that just avoids that process because they have access to make the change, doesn't quite work for internal fraud, but maybe it is a deterrence depending on the person that's trying to get the change made. But if it is a vendor team member, it's not really a good way to avoid internal fraud because they have access to change it. And not only do they have access to change vendor banking without having to go through that process, but they can also just create a fake vendor and add fraudulent banking details without having to go through that process. So that's one reason why I don't recommend having a separate person perform the confirmation call just for the reducing internal and external fraud. But there are a couple other reasons as well. The second reason is because now you have additional people, right? That separate person, and that separate person, by the way, is probably going to have a backup person for when they are out. So now you have at least two people that have access to sensitive information that are outside of the vendor team. And so except for the fact that they have to make this confirmation call and confirm banking, they would not have access to sensitive information. And that sensitive information, of course, is the vendor banking. And if you have in place what I recommend, where you are requiring the vendors that have to change banking to also provide existing banking, now you have to give those folks access, right? Those separate persons, those separate team members outside of the vendor team access to go into the vendor master file and look at the existing vendor banking to verify that it is correct, like what they submitted on the form is correct. And so now you have additional people outside of the vendor team that have access to vendor sensitive information. And if you weren't having them perform those confirmation calls, it would not be necessary. Now, the next reason is most times it's only the confirmation call that is assigned, right, to these separate folks. It's not combined with the entry of the banking information. So you're really missing out on a step that can help to avoid internal fraud. And how can it help to avoid internal fraud if you also have them responsible for entering in the banking information? Well, that means that you can now remove the access from the vendor team to enter in banking information. And if you remove that access and put that only on the folks that are making that confirmation call, give them an additional step. And by the way, only give them access to add or change vendor banking. Don't give them access to do anything else. On the vendor team side, give them access to do everything else. Don't give them access to add or change vendor banking. And that's the step that I think is missing when this confirmation call or when the confirmation call step is given to someone outside of the vendor team. Now, the last reason I don't recommend it is because the confirmation calls, the way that most of them are done today, is only done at the time of a change in banking and not also when adding banking. And why does that matter? Well, if you are going to do what I just suggested, which means have the team, the non-vendor team members that are making the confirmation call, also combine that with the entry of banking information. If you are only having them confirm bank changes, that means that you can't take away access from the vendor team to add and change banking because typically those are the same. You can't give one access without the other. So if they have access to add, they can also change and vice versa. And so you have to give the vendor team access to be able to add or edit the banking information because they are setting up new vendors and new vendors have banking, right? And so now you have to have both the vendor team and the separate team members or the non-vendor team members have access to add and edit banking. Okay, so those are the reasons why I don't recommend it. And within those reasons, you can see now how I recommend that process for the confirmation call and updating banking, adding banking needs to be done. And so here is how I would set that up. So the first thing is this whole process or all of these steps are based on the fact that I have removed or reduced the number of people that have access to add and update banking. And specifically, the vendor team does not have access to add or update banking. The separate team members that have the responsibility for the confirmation call have that access. So let's run through it. So step one of the process, and this can be a vendor add or vendor change. So the vendor team would accept the documents as normal, right? W-9, vendor setup form, vendor banking form. They would perform the required validations. And by the way, for the required validations, I recommend That at the very least, you check the bank branch details. So for US, it's the routing numbers. And with US routing numbers, you want to make sure that you have the correct routing number for the type of payment. Some banks separate routing numbers based on wires versus ACH payments, some not, but you need to check that too. Or maybe you have a routing number for Canada, or maybe you have a BIC code or SWIFT code, right? If it's outside of the US and not in a IBAN country. If it's in the IBAN, check that too. Because a lot of times vendors always keep up when their banks merge or get acquired. And so you want to make sure that you're doing a validation on that bank branch to make sure that number is correct. Now, if you have bank account ownership validation, it'll do that, or to include the bank branch number as well. So you don't have to, but if you don't have that, make sure you're at least checking the bank branch number to make sure it's correct. All right, so vendor team accepts the documents, performs the validations. Now, the second step, if if there is banking to add or to change, and yes, I said add to. So if there is banking to add or change, then that is sent to a separate team member. So the vendor team can go in and they can add or update, uh, add the vendor record, update an existing vendor record, right, with everything except banking. But if there is banking to add or change to the vendor record, then once that vendor record is created, they send the request for the banking add or change to the separate team member. The separate team member will then contact or make that confirmation call for both the vendor banking add or the vendor banking change. And there are quite a few teams out there, companies out there that are making that confirmation call for both vendor adds and vendor changes when it comes to banking. And for ads, it's great because they can verify it's a valid vendor. It also is a deterrence because if any vendor team member that used to have access, right, to the vendor banking, now they can't go in and change the vendor's banking to their own, but they also can't go in and create a fake vendor for a bank payment, right, for an electronic payment. So that's a deterrence in itself, helping to avoid internal fraud. And then also, it can, verify that the banking details are correct, that it wasn't a fat finger on the form, right? So they can verify that. And then once they make that confirmation call and the confirmation call is successful, they can enter the banking details on the vendor master file, whether it's adding banking to a new vendor, or maybe it's even a vendor that used to have, a check payment method, and now you've convinced them, right, for electronic payments. So, now you have banking, and so they will enter in new banking, or they can then update the existing banking details to the new updated banking details. So the separate team member will make that confirmation call, verify that it's a valid vendor, that the numbers are correct, and then enter or update the banking details on the vendor record. Now, once they are done with that, the next step is to send the request back to the vendor team and let them know that the vendor team, or that the vendor's banking has been added or updated to the vendor master file as requested. Now, here's a step that you just don't get when you only have a vendor team member, right, making the confirmation call, and or adding, doing the adding or the editing of the vendor's banking information on the vendor master file, on the vendor record. Now, if you have a separate team member doing it and then you send non-vendor team member doing it and you send it to the vendor team, they send it to the vendor team when it's done. Now the vendor team member can confirm the entry was correct, right? That the separate team member or non-vendor team member didn't fat finger it. And you don't necessarily get that if you only have a vendor team member making that entry. If you don't have, right, an approval as part of the vendor team or as part of the vendor master file, right, that vendor record being added or updated, then there's no separate review of that built into the process. But now you can do that. Also, want to reiterate at this step here that the vendor team member still does not have access to add or edit the vendor banking. They have access to review it, right? So they can check and make sure it's correct against the vendor banking documents that was submitted, but they do not have access to add or edit. So if there is anything wrong, then you circle back to the step before, send that information back to that separate team member, non-vendor team member, and have them corrected. And then the process starts again, where it goes back to the team member to review, confirm the entry is correct. And once that's done, the process is complete. And so I like that it adds in, right, that segregation of duties, adds in the ability to avoid internal fraud because it's taking away the access of the vendor team members to add or edit banking details. So it stops the fraud that would have occurred if the vendor team still had access because they can no longer send ACH or wire, right, electronic payments to themselves. And you can also, by the way, I'm talking about banking, but this can be done for addresses as well. But that gives even more access to the separate team members. So I know that for addresses, it could be an issue because a lot of times, right, the addresses are not just remittance addresses. You're also adding ordering addresses, right? You're adding tax addresses. So you may want to kind of double think how you do that for check remittance payments or remittance addresses for check payment methods. I'll say it that way. But many of you are reducing how many check payments you have, so it could work for you as is. But at the very least, it reduces the potential for internal fraud when you are looking at fraud, vendor team members that have access to update banking. By taking that away, giving that to a separate team member outside of the vendor team, but then also having a vendor team member confirm it that the entry was correct. It also reduces the potential that that separate team member will try to perpetrate fraud as well. All right. So now the process is complete. You've got some additional controls in place. You've got that additional personnel in place that, yes, does have access to add, edit banking details. But since add, edit is restricted on the vendor team, now you still have less potential for internal fraud. You also have less potential for external fraud because number one, you are making the confirmation call and you have less potential for unsuccessful payments because someone is checking the entry into the system to make sure that there were no fat fingers that ordinarily you wouldn't have if the separate person were only making that confirmation call. So the real key here, actually, I should say, the real critical keys, plural, is one, you not only have them make the confirmation call, but you also require them to do the entry onto the vendor master file for just those banking details fields, and you take away the access for add and editing, right? Banking information from the vendor team. And third one is you require that confirmation call for both add and edit vendor records or banking on vendor records, because that is how you're going to be able to sustain taking away the access of entering vendor banking from the vendor team. You have to do it for both ads and changes. All right, so that is it. Now, I didn't mention this, but if you want some help with that confirmation call, I do have a confirmation call toolkit that gives you not only some scripts that you can say in different scenarios, like uh, adding adding banking information, changing banking information, even leaving a voicemail as long as you have authentication in place, which is also included in the confirmation toolkit, how to do that as well. I also have in there a confirmation call log so you can track it, and it does come with everything that you need to put a auditable, standardized confirmation call process in place, including a best practices document. So I will put a link to that in the show notes. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 355th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.